Hello students! In this video, you will learn how to write a short story. You will learn some writing tips and also how to structure the plot of your story. First of all, what is a short story? A short story focuses on one plot, that is, the main events of the story, and one main character, with a few additional minor characters. A short story is based on real or imaginary events. Short stories are written to interest and entertain the reader. So how do you write a good short story? Here are some tips. Use your imagination. Think of an interesting character in an interesting situation. Think of your main character and what you're going to say about this person. But it's hard to imagine the whole thing in your head before you start. That's why it's a good idea to make an outline before you start writing. Make a basic outline and then fill out the details. Get a sheet of paper and write down in a few words who the main character is, what the situation is at the start, what happens next, and how things end. Choose a title that fits your story. A good title should be interesting and it should attract the reader's attention. When you write a story, you must decide who is telling the story. Use the first person I if you're someone in the story, such as the main character. Use the third person he, she, they to tell the story from the position of an observer or storyteller. The voice through which you tell your story is the point of view. Think of an interesting beginning to capture the reader's interest. Use linking words to show how your story unfolds. These are words like as a result, so, but, although, nevertheless, as, etc. Use time words to help the reader follow the order of events in your story. These are words like first, next, then, afterwards, before, as soon as, while, after, later, suddenly, all of a sudden, finally, etc. Use past tenses such as the simple past, past continuous, and past perfect because the events have already happened. Describe the character's feelings. For example, you can use adjectives like they were amused, amazed, delighted, horrified, or you can use the expression to their amusement, to my amazement, to our delight, to his horror, to my surprise, etc. For example, you can write something like, to my horror, I realized I couldn't escape. Use interesting vocabulary to impress the reader. So instead of writing, he looked at her quickly, write, he glanced at her. Instead of bad accident, say horrible or tragic accident. Include a variety of grammatical structures, such as conditionals, inversion, participle clauses, etc. For example, use participle clauses like, terrified by the strange noise, I hid under the blanket, or feeling nervous, he walked into the room. You can use inversion to add emphasis. For example, never before had I felt so alive. Add variety by using direct speech on occasion. This consists of the spoken words inside quotation marks, followed by he said, or she shouted, she replied, etc. For example, you can write something like, don't move, she whispered. Use one or two sentences in direct speech to emphasize the most dramatic parts of your story. Use action and detailed description. Pay attention to punctuation. Use exclamation marks, ellipses, etc. Start a new paragraph when you start a new topic. For example, write one paragraph to set the scene and a separate paragraph to describe the protagonist's feelings. You should also begin a new paragraph when you move from one location to another. Finally, edit your story. Cut anything that's not important to your story. Let's have a look at the plan of a story. Aristotle said that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So every story has three parts: the introduction, the main body, and the conclusion. In the introduction, set the scene. Tell your readers who the characters are. Give some information about the characters, some basic and interesting facts, so the readers know who they're reading about. Also, tell your readers where and when the story is set. In the main body, use different paragraphs to explain what happened in chronological order. Give details of what happened. Narrate the events leading up to the climax. The climax is the peak of the action. In the conclusion, say what happened in the end. Write a satisfying ending. It can be a happy ending or an unhappy ending, anything you want. Many stories have a structure that follows 5 basic stages. The first stage is the introduction. The introduction sets the scene. It gives information about the setting and the characters, and it describes their everyday life. It also introduces the point of view, the position from which the story is told, which is often the third person, he, she, they. To give you an example, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, we start by getting a sense of the hatred between the Montagues and the Capulets. Then something happens which triggers the story. For example, Romeo decides to attend the Capulets' ball. The action starts. We call this rising action. Rising action is a series of events that lead toward the climax. The protagonist wants something and searches for it. It might be money, love, survival, etc. Then there is a pleasant or unpleasant surprise. Eventually, the protagonist faces the greatest obstacle and is forced to make a choice. This leads to the climax. In Romeo and Juliet, Romeo wants to secretly marry Juliet. Then they get into trouble. At some point, the action reaches a climax. The climax is the most exciting part of the story. For example, the plot of Romeo and Juliet reaches its climax when Romeo kills Tybalt. After that, things change. That's where falling action starts. Falling action is what happens after the climax. It leads to the end of the story. Things begin to get better or things get even worse. In Romeo and Juliet, for example, Juliet fakes her death. Believing Juliet is dead, Romeo buys poison to end his life. The solution is the conclusion that solves everything within the story. The conclusion gives us a sense of final satisfaction with the whole situation. Characters have learned an important lesson through their experiences, and the story is complete. In Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet die, and the two families agree to end their hatred. Now you can use this structure to write your own story. These are the sources I used. I hope this video has helped you learn how to plan and write your short story. Happy writing!